A warm welcome und herzlich willkommen from Toronto, Canada. Schönen guten Nachmittag nach Österreich. Good morning to our speakers and also to some audience here in Canada. My name is Gregor Postel. I'm the Trade Commissioner from the Austrian Chamber of Commerce here in our office in Toronto. And I'm happy to have you here and thank you for your interest regarding our webinar, Addressing Urban Housing Challenges, Opportunities for Sustainable Building Solutions in Canada. Maybe just shortly brief you about the agenda we will have. We will have a welcome and a short introduction then from my colleague before we hand over to the two experts which we have today with their very contentful and informative presentation. At the end, we have a question and answer session. So, but before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. The webinar will be recorded and you will get in a couple of days a link where you can watch once again the webinar and as well the presentation slides will be handed over to you and sent to you by email in the next couple of days. Since we're using MS Teams as a format for this webinar, I would kindly ask you to mute your microphone and to switch off your camera because the webinar, as stated before, will be recorded. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat function and write us what it is. We will then contact you and hopefully solve swiftly your problem. And please use the chat for the question and answers because as said before, we have a question and answer session at the end from our presentations, and hopefully you will use the chance to get some more information and asking questions. This leads me more now to give the floor to Sarah Grosinger. She is in our team and the expert in the field of sustainability, green building and automotive. And she will now make a short introduction about sustainable building solutions in Canada and about the market here and the potential for Austrian companies in the Canadian market. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, also from my end, good morning to our experts in Canada and good afternoon to all the participants in Austria. To start off the topic, if you have followed Canadian news probably throughout the last couple of months, you might have come across some of these headlines that we're seeing now, which clearly make it very obvious that the housing crisis, as well as the need for adoption of sustainable building practices, are currently of utmost urgency. Well, I would say let's dive deeper into the iceberg of challenges that Canada currently faces. So at the visible top, as we just heard, lies the evident houses crisis, right? With the hardworking Canadians currently having troubles really financing and afford housing. The government therefore has allocated nearly 53 billion currently in new spendings over the next 5 years, with the significant portion of 9 billion Canadian dollars dedicated to housing initiatives only. So central to these efforts is going to be the Canadian Housing Plan, as they call it, which aims to unlock almost 4 million of new homes by 2031. As you can see, this is a really ambitious plan, particularly looking at the fact that this means that over the course of the next 7 years, there would be more than 550,000 new homes to be built each and every year. And looking back at Canada's history of building new residential buildings, we have seen the peak in 2021, I think, with roughly 270,000 new homes, which means now the target is to build more than double this amount per year. However, beneath this commitment to build all these houses lies a whole another crucial layer, the ambitious goals of Canada for net zero. Canada targets to reach net zero by 2050. And these intertwined challenges, both of the housing crisis as well as the climate goals, they demand obviously sustainable solutions that not only address the housing supply and affordability, but at the same time align with the set climate objectives. Now, how are these challenges and goals intrinsically linked? The crucial connection that often gets overlooked is the intricate relationship between climate and housing. When we factor in materials and construction emissions from the building sector in Canada, they make up approximately 30% of the national's total emissions, which, to my surprise, rivals the figure of the emissions from the oil and gas industry. And usually, the first things that come to mind when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions in buildings are likely factories or other large-scale economically operated buildings, while in fact a staggering 97% of the building emissions are caused by residential buildings, and this primarily through the energy consumption. So particularly residential buildings obviously play a pivotal role when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. To put that whole into perspective, in Canada alone, approximately 1/4 of all energy consumed is dedicated to running households, which is a considerable chunk of energy usage that is directly linked to the homes. And despite the political differences, there's a resounding knowledge across the party lines regarding the severity of both the housing and the climate crisis, whereby both the conservatives and liberals alike are advocating for aggressive solutions. The expert panel, which is called the Housing and Climate Council, basically has put out a roadmap that there is a need of even 5.8 million of low carbon, affordable and resilient homes to be built until 2030, which even is more than the Canadian Housing Plan has targeted so far. And there are currently a lot of government subsidies out to really advocate for the green building practices and make sure that they can be sustainably applied. Now, we've seen the challenges. Let's shift the focus to the opportunities arising from these challenges. The Canadian housing innovation sector is currently fueled by significant investments. Over 600 million in Canadian dollars are allocated by the government currently towards innovative housing technologies as well as materials. These consist of the establishment of a 50 million home building technology and innovation fund, which basically opens doors for collaboration and commercialization of advanced housing solutions, which might be particularly of interest for firms specializing in prefabrication, mass timber production, and 3D printing. These companies can leverage this fund to enter the Canadian market and showcase their experience. Another 500 million are allocated for new rental housing projects, which present businesses with a prime opportunity to showcase their capabilities in prefabrication and modular construction, as there's currently a significant demand for solutions that just streamline construction timelines and as well enhance efficiency at the same time. And last but not least, the launch of the modernized housing design catalog is supported by a budget of roughly 12 million or 11.6 million Canadian dollars to be exact. This catalog supports companies that specialize in modular homes, row housing, fourplexes, basically provides a platform for these companies to showcase their designs and technologies, and is aimed to really streamline housing approvals and the construction timelines for that matter. Anyways, I think at the moment it's enough theoretical input from our end. Let's move on to the main event, to our experts. We're honored today to introduce our esteemed speakers who both bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our webinar. First up, we have David McMillan, who is a program manager with the City of Toronto's Environment and Climate Division. He has a background in environmental studies from York University And David has been a driving force in planning for low carbon development and energy systems for almost a decade now. He works closely with internal partners at the city, as well as the development industry to achieve net zero emission buildings. Currently, his focus lies on delivering mass timber affordable housing and creating online platforms to facilitate new renewable thermal energy projects leveraging city-owned assets. Then joining David is Michael Sugar, whose expertise lies in Earth system science. And as the director of Zero Carbon Building, Michael currently oversees the world's first zero carbon building standard. And his work with the Canadian Green Building Council, or short the CAGBC, builds momentum for an innovative Made in Canada framework, leading the Zero Carbon Steering Committee to advance design and performance standards. With 12 years of experience in decarbonizing the built environment, Michael has built over 50 megawatts of renewable energy projects across Canada as well as the US, contributing significantly towards greenhouse gas reduction roadmaps for over 30 million square feet. So let me officially open the floor to our speakers. David, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. My name is David McMillan with the City of Toronto. Today I'm going to speak to you about what I really see as one intertwined problem, which is addressing our housing and climate crises with innovative solutions that we're piloting here in the City of Toronto that I'm sure you're familiar with, but I'll go through a couple of local examples and explain how I think this can scale up to help address these crises that we're facing here. So first, a little bit of background. So you might have heard of Transform TO. It's our climate targets, our climate plan in Toronto. Essentially, we need to get to net zero emissions citywide by 2040, which was accelerated a few years ago from an initial 2050 target. You know, the graph on the left shows we're sort of on pace, but the challenge is getting more significant. And so my work really is on how do we accelerate the pace of work to get to that net zero target by 2040. Just for reference, most of our emissions in Toronto, almost 60%, come from buildings. And to be clear, this inventory is really operational emissions, and I'll get to the difference with embodied. The point is we have a lot of work to do to get there. And at the bottom there, for new city buildings, the target is net zero now. Basically, we need to lead by example. For the rest of the industry, that goal is 2028. And so the way we're going to do that really is with the Toronto Green Standard, which is our own green building standard. What you see on the right-hand side there is that's a trajectory of the TGS. So we're now in version 4. Starting in 2025, actually, our council told us we need to accelerate the carbon target specifically. And so we're actually accelerating the Toronto Green Standard to go even faster. This is how we're going to get to net zero new development by 2028, which, you know, it's only a few years away. Given the development cycles in Toronto, that means developers now need to be planning for that reality. So we also have really ambitious housing targets, and I'll just give a brief overview of these. So basically, we've committed to the provincial government that by 2030, we'll deliver almost 300,000 new homes. Within that category, that broad category, we have to deliver, you know, council has directed us to deliver 65,000 rent-controlled units. And so that's a mix of, you know, affordable and market. But the point is that's 65,000 units delivered within the next, you know, 5 or 6 years, many of which need to be affordable. You know, specifically, you know, we're talking 25,000 rent-controlled homes, a huge portion of which are non-market, and there's a cost to do affordable housing. So I don't want to downplay how significant of a challenge this is for the City of Toronto. On the left there, I just want to highlight one of the programs we use to do that is called Housing Now. It's about 5 years old, and that's really doing affordable housing on city-owned land with our development partner, CreateTO. And it's now sort of branching off into a new program called Parking to Homes, where we're specifically focused on doing, you know, new typologies on city-owned land that are specifically parking lots, which are, you know, not a great use for a city where there's a much more intense housing need. So what does housing now look like in practice? So this is our first site. This is Bloor Kipling in the west part of Toronto. We recently broke ground on our new civic center, and the first housing block 1, is under construction right now. So this is the first site that's underway several years later, but we're really excited about it. One, because we're going to be getting almost 3,000 new housing units, including a large portion of affordable units. And from my perspective, this is how we address housing and climate in the same vein, because the Civic Center will actually be hosting a district energy plant powered by, or with heating and cooling provided by a geo-exchange system that will serve all 3 million square feet of the entire precinct. So this is how we, on city land, deliver affordable housing that is also low carbon. But in this case, this development was planned years ago. We're actually not accounting for embodied carbon, which is a huge part of the story now. We have a very clean grid in Ontario, which we're very fortunate to have. So that really means that as long as we electrify heating and cooling, like with GeoExchange, we're essentially avoiding operational carbon. Problem is, we're not accounting for the embodied carbon, the carbon in materials, which Sarah spoke about earlier, which it's not in our inventory, but we figure it's another 1 million tons of CO2 per year, which our inventory is around 15 million. So it's a significant portion of carbon. So a couple of years ago, we started down the path of at least understanding what embodied carbon looks like in Toronto and maybe taking a first step to address it. So this presentation, by the way, is full of links, and so you can definitely read up on these studies. But the point is, these were our first sort of endeavors to actually start regulating embodied carbon in new development. This slide really is just meant to indicate that we have now targets in our Toronto Green Standard. For the industry, they are voluntary because they're new. Of course, with the next version of the TGS, we'll always look at making them mandatory. But the point is that they are quite aggressive. And for the city, we're actually making them mandatory starting now. So we are leading by example to try and do low embodied carbon development for any city-led projects. So one of the obvious examples, because we've seen it elsewhere, but is new for us in Toronto, is mass timber housing, particularly mass timber structures, because structure is about 60 to 70% of the embodied carbon of a residential building, at least your typical concrete building. The other advantages of mass timber, it's right now actually, depending on the building design, it's definitely faster than concrete. It can actually be more cost effective. Right now, formwork in Ontario is actually very expensive, driven in large part by just cost inflation and the fact that those trades are very busy delivering not just housing, but all kinds of infrastructure. The other advantage with mass timber structures, they're so light, you can really minimize below grade work where there's a lot of cost and carbon. And in Toronto, we no longer have minimum parking requirements. So, you can essentially do slab on grade construction, which really is an advantage for mass timber. So a couple of years ago, we set out to do our own projects in Toronto. Again, these are city-led projects on city land, working with our development partner, Creatio. We set out to do our first mass timber affordable housing projects. So really on the left there are 2 mid-rise projects that we are advancing, one on Dundas Street and one on Danforth, 2 of our main avenues. And then on the third there is, it was a design that we just tried to do, essentially an 18-story timber hybrid building. This is a couple of years ago. Fast forward to today, which I'll speak about a little bit later, and 18 stories is soon to be allowed in building code for mass timber. So, I mean, it's no longer necessarily have to be a hybrid, although for design reasons, it likely will be. The point is, we are advancing these projects because we want to prove out the case for low carbon affordable housing. So this is our Dundas project. This is in for rezoning, which is almost complete. We'll soon be going to market for a development partner and hopefully under construction by the end of the year. So this is, it's a 10-story building on the avenue, slab on grade, as I mentioned. Only one step back, which, I won't get into the details, but this is a bit of a departure from traditional mid-rise on the avenues in Toronto, but I think it reflects where we're headed as a city. So we're using primarily cross-laminated timber for the floor, roof, and wall panels. Right now, we're planning to expose 25%, but through the building code alternative solutions process, I think we'll look to expose more because it's a beautiful material that we want residents to enjoy. The structural support is largely glulam beams and columns. And because of lateral strength requirements, we are at this point designing for a steel core. But obviously there's plenty of innovation happening that in the future might allow us to do an all wood building more cost effectively. So in terms of housing and climate, where it comes together, when you look at the preliminary embodied carbon assessment, we're at 218 kilograms of CO2 per square meter, which is extremely low relative to a concrete building. I mean, which is typically 400 to 500. And we are not counting the biogenic carbon, so the ability to sequester. But in a future scenario where, we have some sense of control of what happens at end of life, if we were to count that biogenic carbon, I mean, this would be a carbon negative structure at least. And we haven't gotten to the envelope design yet. So of course there will be carbon associated with that. But in terms of the structure alone, this is the kind of building that can actually reduce net emissions. So at a high level, really, based on the analysis we've done so far, we can get to net zero emissions, so operational, for about a 3% cost premium capital. The mass timber structure is actually on par with concrete today, which is amazing. It was not what we expected when we started this project. Again, slab on grade construction, minimal concrete use, and it goes up quickly. So the business case is solid. Again, likely a steel core for lateral strength. And really, this will be a prefabricated construction because that's how we'll basically be able to do this quickly and cost effectively. So what does this look like in terms of a program? I mean, I think we're looking primarily at avenues, but again, mid-rise buildings, I think we're going to be going to 18 stories in building code. So we'll start to be able to do towers as of right in timber. We need to have a flexible approach to built form. So boxier buildings are better. No parking, ideally. Focus on carbon and optimize for that, and then enable prefabrication for sure. It's faster and less waste. So I just want to now quickly, just a few more slides on the housing approach. So we are taking the lead as a public builder now in Toronto. It's a new endeavor for us, or new at least in my lifetime, where we're going to be doing essentially starting with 5 sites over the next few years, scaling up very quickly after that to any city-owned projects. All of these buildings have to have no fossil fuel use. And because we want to go quickly, I think there's a huge opportunity for mass timber. So these are the first 5 sites, and I've just given you some details to give you a sense of maybe how they'll be built. Dundas is on there, which is going to be mass timber. There's a couple of smaller projects where there's potential for hybrids of mass timber and lightwood framing, which may be the optimum in terms of cost and speed. This is the one we're working on at that scale. It's a 6-story, 30-unit building. Again, on city-owned land, on a parking lot. We haven't designed it yet, only high level, but we're evaluating actually a mix of cross-laminated timber floors and lightwood framing, so basically traditional framing for the walls, because it looks to be the best combination of speed and cost, at least on paper. But this is the kind of sort of infill just behind the avenue, behind like a Dundas site, where we're transitioning to what you might consider more the traditional neighborhoods. But this is an important housing solution too, especially for families where we can deliver often larger units here in this typology. So very quickly, I think how we scale up really is the big question for me. So we have some examples with our supportive housing program, which was federally funded and delivered rapidly. But these were modular, volumetric modular units. I don't think this is not what will scale to larger buildings, and they did not achieve net zero emissions. So for phase 3, essentially, we're setting out parameters so that we do achieve net zero emissions, and with a model that doesn't necessarily require modular, that enables panelized and the use of mass timber. That is something that will scale to larger buildings. And so this is all not happening in a vacuum, and Sarah mentioned some of these things already, but we have direction now to proceed with parking to homes. We have endorsement to expand our roster of prefabricated design builders. The building code is going to be going to 18 stories encapsulated mass timber. We have the province and the federal government both endorsing sort of pre-designed buildings, prefabrication, and the use of mass timber. So government at all levels is behind this, which is great. So ultimately, where I see this going is 50 to 100 city-owned sites, including where we partner with not-for-profits, where we can do the initial due diligence, and then we hand over to the sites to market partners design builders, like on the right-hand side here, you see a project by Sirotny Group. This is in Toronto, and Intelligent City below that in Vancouver. Both of these are active. These companies are active across the country now, and they're not the only ones. There are others as well who are doing prefabricated mid-rise buildings out of timber. I think we need strategic alignment with our funding partners because funding is critical, especially for not-for-profits. We need to be able to do rapid design iteration and fast approvals. That's key. So when we talk about a design catalog, it needs to be also rapidly approved by municipalities. So ultimately, we want to see factories here. We want to see distributed manufacturing. We want to see companies investing here to deliver these buildings because that's how we'll scale. The city will do its part, but we need private sector partners to help with that. So that's it for me. I will stop sharing and hand it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, David. Michael, if you're ready, I would ask you to please take the stage and share your knowledge with us.
Yes, thank you. Great job, David and Sarah. Thanks for setting the stage. I think everyone can see my slides now. So thank you. My name again is Michael Sugar. I am with the Canada Green Building Council, accounting for an estimated 11%. So in total, we're looking at just shy of 30% of emissions. And Canada's National Inventory Report was just released for 2024 for the reporting year of 2022 last week. And actually, buildings crept up above the transportation sector as the second highest emitter after oil and gas. This is largely a result of post-pandemic lifestyles, people not necessarily commuting into work anymore. So we can't hit our carbon pollution targets without addressing buildings. And in an effort to slash emissions, as Sarah noted, by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, the federal government announced some $9.1 billion in investments that will, among other things, boost incentives for zero-emission vehicles. There'll be sweetened tax breaks for companies in the fossil fuel sector even to deploy carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS technology, but and also to clean the electricity grid. But there is a massive component for greening the building sector as well, as it is now the second or third leading emitter, depending on which year you're looking at. So for Canada to achieve its 20 and 2050 climate targets, building owners and operators will need to upgrade, retrofit, and ultimately decarbonize hundreds of millions of square meters of buildings in the next 5 to 10 years. But into 2050, it seems like a very large scale and problem to solve. So this, I don't want to get too much into the climate science here. I want to get into buildings again, but this is what the IPCC refers to as the remaining carbon budget. I've selected 500 gigatons of CO2, which is a 50% likelihood to keep within global warming on a 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. And essentially all this is meant to illustrate is if we pull down on the first graphic here, the blue line represents just a steady trajectory of decarbonizing globally from 2020 from 2000 to 2050. But the delta between the green and the blue line shows that we've actually exceeded this remaining carbon budget of 500 gigatons in this dark gray area. So what we need to do is we need to pull down our emissions of CO2, say by 50% by 2030. If we have a larger decrease in our emissions from 2000 to 2030, then we'll actually have more time to emit that CO2 into 2050. However, in the second graph, if we only pull that line down by 40%, we actually take 5 years off of our remaining carbon budget. So now we have to actually accelerate our decarbonization from 2030 to 2045. And just to illustrate this point, if we only reduce our emissions by 25% by 2030, then we have emitted more carbon and eaten up more of our remaining carbon budget than we have. So that purple line now is at an even steeper incline, and we have to hit net zero to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040. Right. So that's the climate science and the sort of the motivation. So moving into our rating standard and why it's important. What is a zero carbon building? So with definitions, I like to just read them and not ad lib. So a ZCB is a highly energy efficient building that produces on site or procures carbon-free renewable energy or high-quality carbon offsets in an amount sufficient to offset the annual carbon emissions associated with building materials and operations. And I have to stress this. One of the main reasons carbon offsets are allowed in the standard are to allow for the offset of embodied carbon, because without them, as David showed, even with a mass timber building, your embodied carbon intensity is still around 200 to 250 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. So it would be impossible to reach net zero carbon today with today's construction and building material industry as is. But as we are seeing today, this is really changing quickly. All right, on April 12th, the federal government released Canada's housing plan. We heard about this in the past two presentations, but one particular statement in the plan that we would like to amplify in violent agreement is that buildings that are energy efficient and climate resilient can help reduce the lifetime cost of maintaining a home by lowering utility bills and insurance costs. That is very true. We'd like to also maybe add on to that statement and say, what about the way we build our buildings and resilient housing? And so the plan also contains a few investments, as we've detailed, that will have a positive impact on innovators within prefabricated construction, modularity, and even 3D printing. So $50 million of that is apportioned for the Home Building Technology and Innovation Fund. That's to help scale up, commercialize, and promote the adoption of innovative housing technologies and building in Canada's home building industry. And some of the projects that we've certified through the ZCB program have actually sourced their mass timber from Austria. So that's an interesting little closed loop system. And there are tremendous opportunities for investment in this space in Canada around the energy transition and also the way that we lower our embodied carbon of new buildings. Houses are meant to house people. They need to be resilient. As the climate changes, we're going to see more extreme weather as well. So the architectural systems protecting these people in their homes is of the utmost importance. So that's what we refer to as building resiliency. So I'll get into that a little bit more. I just wanted to tie this back to zero carbon. These federal initiatives are intended to lower the capital cost premium and capital adjustment, the cap rate, essentially, to make building these energy efficient and resilient buildings more palatable. So these are three programs that are linked here. I could send the links in the chat later, that are explicitly referencing the zero carbon building certification. That includes the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation MLI Select Program, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM, Green Municipal Fund, and then there's also a recently topped up federal program called the Government of Canada Green and Inclusive Communities and Buildings. So there are multifaceted programs that are targeting not just buildings, but green infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. So there's a lot of investment and movement in this sector nationwide. So back to zero carbon buildings, why do we think they are critical to the green building space in Canada? So among many other things, they reduce the climate impacts of construction and operation. They increase resilience to climate change. They protect asset values, which is something that building owners are trying to quantify now. I'm working on getting some updated numbers on what the asset valuations are for a zero carbon building versus not. We hope to have that published by June of this year. Reduced operating costs. So there's something called the split incentive between owners and tenants. If you make a zero carbon building that's super energy efficient, costs a bit more, but the costs are actually reaped by the tenants if they're paying the utility bills. So that's something that is still a challenge that needs to be addressed, and there are clever ways of doing so through incentives and other things. ZCBs also improve occupant comfort, health, and productivity, and they're an excellent way to just demonstrate leadership and for market differentiation as well. They're a really important resource for meeting investor expectations, which are growing around ESG and performance risk as well. And they protect, lastly, against escalating energy and carbon pollution costs, as this is expected, especially on the carbon front, to be further regulated. We have a carbon tax in Canada. It's currently at $170 per ton, which, sorry, it's at $85 a ton right now, and it's going to $170 a ton by 2030. This is obviously tied to the federal government and who's in charge, but they expect this carbon tax to go to $300 a ton by 2050, which is staggering. So these are all ways to protect your asset value by fuel switching and lowering your embodied carbon. That's exactly what you can do. All right, this is just a snapshot of the adoption rate, market adoption across Canada. Leading the way is Ontario in the center, sort of right center of your screen with now we have over 40 certifications and 110 registrations for zero carbon. This includes both standards. There's the design standard for new construction and major renovations. And then there's also the performance standard as well, which is to verify the annual performance period of any existing building that has not had an impact on climate. And so we are the third-party verifiers that look at essentially the utility bills from a building and show that they have effectively offset, either through avoided emissions or carbon offsets or renewable energy credits, their annual emissions. So just to touch on what and how we calculate a zero carbon balance, the net emissions are equal to the embodied carbon, so all the emissions from constructing and sourcing materials and manufacturing a building, plus the operational carbon through the life cycle of that building, which in Canada, we typically use 60 years. I think in Europe, they use 50 years. And inside of that, we include direct emissions, so on-site emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, natural gas for heating. And it also includes indirect emissions from Scope 2 emissions from purchasing electricity where the emissions are offsite. Then we subtract the avoided emissions. That is either on-site renewable energy, could be off-site renewable energy through a power purchase agreement. In Alberta, they have PPAs that are allowed. We're working on that same sort of structure and program in Ontario. And then lastly, we do allow high quality carbon offsets in the program. Like I said, it is the only way for us to actually achieve a net zero carbon target when you account for the embodied carbon of buildings. We don't have true zero carbon at this present day. Some examples of low embodied carbon projects that CAGBC has certified through the zero carbon program. On the left, we have the Stack. This was certified just last year. It's Vancouver's tallest office building. So pretty significant window to wall ratio, lots of glazing. It's a concrete structure, and it achieves the first impact and innovation threshold. So I believe it was just under 350 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. On the right, we have Centennial College A block expansion project. This is a very, I'm sure you've seen this image before. We showcase it quite often. It is a mass timber structure and cladding entirely. It achieves the second impact and innovation threshold. So that means that it has, as David had shown, mass timber projects can hover around 220 kilograms of CO2e per meter squared. So these are some exemplary projects deploying mass timber. But today, neither of those are housing. I'd like to just focus my last few minutes on what we recently certified in Winnipeg, Canada, which is in Manitoba. And this was the first project in Canada to certify to ZCB Design V3. It is an affordable housing 21-story complex in the downtown Winnipeg zoning sector. And, you know, at CGBC, we have, I think we're the second leading country in LEED certified space after mainland China. I always got questions, why are you focusing on a ZCB and not LEED? You have so many examples of LEED, but I think it's an important symbol to show that in Winnipeg, a very cold climate, it's in climate zone 7, was able to achieve a 21-story all-electric BIPV clad non-mass timber building that has 214 units. Of them, 86 units are for affordable housing. And I'll get into the specifics around the funding opportunities and the capital that this building was able to attract from the federal and provincial and municipal governments. But it's a significant milestone for Canada. So I just want to take you guys through a whistle-stop tour of the building. So here are some of the project contributors. The University of Winnipeg Community Renewal Corporation is a not-for-profit charitable organization. They are the owner, along with Lotus Holding, and then these are some of the other stakeholders from engineering and architecture firms. Boxdale is the constructor of record. Okay, the design process for this building. It was a challenge because they had these specific goals for implementing special systems to help the building meet and exceed the threshold required for CMHC MLI Select and new building program support. So I had referenced the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation program that is a way for owners to attract capital to lower the upfront capital for building to a zero carbon design standard. So as such, they were actually targeting a low EUI as part of that goal. So they were targeting an 80 kilowatt hour per meter squared energy efficiency rating, which is very good for a multi-unit residential building. And they were also targeting a 40% improvement over our national energy code for buildings in Canada, which is NECB 2017. These were required targets to secure the CMHC MLI Select funding. The building is currently under construction, as you can see. It, like I said, is a 21-story, 214 units of mixed income housing. There's retail on the main floor. It is a fully electric building, and it is clad in on-site renewables that account for over 9% of its total energy use on any given year, which is unique given the high energy demand for a multi-unit residential building. It is in a cold climate, which means that in the winter, to heat these units and to heat the domestic hot water, it requires a lot of energy as well. So they were very adamant in installing building integrated photovoltaics in order to supplement that high demand. However, most of that demand is in the winter when the solar is probably not generating as much as it typically would in the summer. So they still have their challenges and are drawing on a lot of electricity during the winter. The gross building area is over 15,000 square meters, and its construction commenced in 2023. Its partial occupancy is in December 2025, so they're a few months away from that, and full occupancy will be January of 2026. I just want to highlight some of the key building performance targets that I think are really impressive for a multi-unit residential building. When you account for the BIPV, I want to note just this first row here. They actually came in just 3 kilowatt hour over their goal of 80. When you But however, in Canada, we don't account for renewable energy in EUI typically. So their EUI is 96.7, which is still fantastic for a multi-unit residential building. It's in the 95th percentile in terms of scoring. Its thermal energy demand intensity, so how much heat does it need and how efficient is it with its heating and ventilation systems, is 39. This is slightly over our target for Climate Zone 7, but since they're all electric, they were able to avoid this TEDI target. And their whole life carbon, which is an important metric emerging in Europe, I think 5 kilograms of CO2e per meter squared per year is sort of the holy grail. This project actually came in below that. It's a function of adding up your embodied carbon and your operational carbon and dividing it over the life cycle of the project, which is 60 years in this case. And just one last point I want to make before we start to move into our question period is this is not a mass timber project. It's concrete. There's a lot of glazing. I think the window to wall ratio is 29%. However, through low carbon concrete mixes, this project was actually able to hit an embodied carbon intensity of 275 kilograms of CO2e per meter squared, which is incredible. And I will just fly through this and wrap up because we are getting low on time. Just one last slide on embodied carbon. We encourage our projects, all of our projects have to actually perform a whole building life cycle assessment to understand what the emissions from embodied carbon are to construct this building. And so I probably don't have enough time to get into how LCAs work, but the average embodied carbon intensity for our program is 373. So this project, 21-story multi-unit residential building, coming in almost 100 basis points below that was, to me, significant. One last slide for me, I know I'm running out of time, is just of the building's 86 affordable units, 25 are to be leased at 59% of CMHC's median market rent. We actually had the Honorable Chrystia Freeland visit the site in February of this year. In all, the federal government was awarding over $16 million just to this one tower. It's part of 4 other towers that are being developed in that same zoning sector. The project confirmed $200,000 through the FCM program, $150,000 in development funding through the CMHC, and like I said, $16 million in federal government funding. It received $2.73 million under the Manitoba Works Capital Incentive Program, which is a provincial program. And through Affordable Housing Now, the City of Winnipeg is also providing tax increment financing to 308 Colony for up to $5 million over 25 years. So lots of public sector involvement in this. One thing that we need to see in Canada is how the private sector does not need to rely so much on public funding and financing. So we need to unlock more capital through private sector investment that will drive the change that we need to see in order so that we can reduce our environmental impacts and also scale up affordable housing across the country. So I think that's all the time I have. I will turn the floor back over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I'd like to hand over to our Trade Commissioner himself, who's going to lead through the Q&A session.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation, and also thank you, David, for your presentation. So, David, please also switch on your camera and your microphone. And we are coming now to the question and answer session. Thank you also that you kept more or less your time frame. So we have roughly 10 minutes time for question and answers. So there is one question for David. How can a contractor with mass timber capabilities get involved in your projects? Is there a procurement homepage to track the opportunities, or is this with invite only, and what qualification is required?
So I'll say the approach that we're thinking of right now is to work with design builders. So I think as opposed to selecting the individual consultants and contractors, we'd rather work with design builders who sort of take control of the project from essentially, designed through to at least completion of the shell. So I think your best bet is to engage with the companies who are doing the design build work. So I mentioned a couple of them: Serotonin Group, Intelligent City, Assembly Corp is another one, very active in Toronto. These are the companies we'd likely want to partner with, because that's how we think we'll be able to do this quickly and at scale. I will say, of course, it's to be determined. We do have a procurement homepage. It's called SAP Ariba, and you can access any procurement opportunities through Ariba. You'll have to register, but happy to guide you through that sort of offline if there's any interest there.
To retrofit existing multi-unit residential buildings where there are people obviously occupying. So you have to do it on a suite by suite basis, which can be very difficult. So that might involve waiting for tenants to turn over and going in and doing unit by unit conversions, which can be very costly and time consuming. The other area that we're seeing some traction is through office conversions to multi-unit residential buildings. That's an area to watch. The commercial office sector, existing buildings in play is, as David had mentioned, developing empty parking lots, which is not a great use of space in an dense urban core. So I'm excited to see that initiative taking shape with the City of Toronto. I think that's a really important way to densify our cities.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add that a lot of what, besides when I'm not working on buildings, I'm working on energy systems, and fuel switching is away from gas is a big part of how we're going to decarbonize. And there are opportunities to fuel switch existing buildings at scale. For example, we're basically decarbonizing an entire hospital right now using wastewater energy. That project is under construction right now in downtown Toronto. So I think there's a case to be made for deep retrofits. There are opportunities where a straight up fuel switch can make economic sense. And so that's something we do as well, and helps to achieve emissions reductions at a large scale.
Another question, David. What is the time frame to get a permit to build a mass timber house in Toronto? Do you have any ideas?
Generally speaking, approvals are slow. The permit process is not actually the bottleneck. I would say typically what takes the longest time is the rezoning, which is essentially to get permissions to build a box of some shape and size. And then the site plan approval can also take some time, which is where you get more into the designs. But I mean, I'm working with my colleagues in city planning and other divisions to streamline those processes, because I guess to your point, if we don't do that quickly, then all the advantages of mass timber in terms of speed of construction are kind of wasted if we don't get through approvals quickly. So it can take years. Unfortunately, we're trying to do it a lot faster, basically almost as of right, if not expedited. Yeah.
Especially in the background that you want to reach the net zero goals, you have to construct quicker, and you need also social housing. So this plays in the hand to have quicker approvals and quicker rezoning. For Michael, there was a nice, interesting point because you were talking about the asset value of zero carbon buildings. Probably you know what we have in the European Union is a kind of energy passport, which you have to show if you want to rent or sell a house, which more or less gives you an overview about the energy category of this building, of this housing unit. Are there any, because this is, I think, in my point of view, because it's all over European Union, it's a kind of also a valuation of the housing. So the better the category is, the higher you can ask for a rent or for a sales price, because there is a lower consumption, lower energy bills. Are there any similar plans in Canada, or is it difficult, or is it just possible on a provincial level?
That's a great question. And there is a patchwork of different building performance standards. Toronto is working on an emissions performance standard now. It's not in effect. There is a provincial EWRB program, which is for energy and water. And I believe the City of Toronto emissions program will roll into the provincial program that sits above it. And there's a plugin on the website that allows you to duly report your emissions and your energy performance. We're at CAGBC really advocating for a unified building performance standard across the country, so that it's not piecemeal or at the municipal level. But absolutely, I know there's in France, there's RE 2020, and there are other programs that are trying to tie together and put a rating on each building, which will, without it, I don't know how you value buildings. It's like I said, it's a bit of a pin the tail on the donkey scenario without a public disclosure of emissions performance or energy performance. But like I said, there's a patchwork of programs that we would like to see unified across the country. I don't know if, David, you could speak to what Toronto is working on.
No, you said it well, so nothing to add there, but thanks. Yeah.
Maybe allow me one last personal question for each of you. Where do you see is the main challenge? Maybe David first and then Michael.
Yeah, I mean, there's several, I think, that are all need to be solved. I think at a large enough scale, capital is going to be a challenge. I mean, to build 5.8 million homes, seen different estimates, but we're into the hundreds of billions of dollars. It could be $1 trillion, believe it or not, just in Canada, which is kind of mind-boggling. So capital will be a problem. Labor will be a secondary problem to that. So I think, but that's an innovation challenge, I think, and because we need to industrialize housing. So I think maybe that's the biggest challenge, is transforming an industry from, that's been for 100 years kind of done the same way into something that exists in other sectors, but not in this one. And so I think that's the biggest challenge collectively that we need to address. So we're trying it at a small scale here in Toronto, but in order to really make it an industry, it needs to be much larger, probably national, to be successful.
For you, Michael, are the
For
same?
me, it is all those. It's time to reach an economy of scale. But there are solutions that are really promising. I think AI, I can't believe we didn't mention AI and BIM softwares and digital twin technology. There are ways that we can, I think, leverage technology in really powerful ways in order to change the construction and the building sector in Canada. But most importantly, I think the sector is willing and open to change now, as opposed to maybe 10 to 15 years ago, it wasn't. We're starting to see this reflected in national codes. I would like to see our rating systems fused into the national codes. That's a pipe dream. But I think the challenge outside of time is just the inertia of this sort of old guard, but it's changing. So I'm optimistic.
Okay, thank you. We are running a little bit over time. So here you see the contact details, and anyway, you will get the slides and link for the recorded video. Just a short preview for the audience. We have 24th to 26th of October our Austria Connect North America. So Austrian subsidiaries in Canada, US, and Mexico meet in Chicago during these days. This is one of our greatest and biggest event every year. Also, Austrian companies coming over from Europe are warmly invited to join. And that leads me to our end. So if you have any further questions regarding this topic or any other questions about the Canadian market, please don't hesitate to contact us. And once again, a big and a warm thank you to David and Michael for the wonderful presentation, also for the very good answers to the questions which we had. And thank you once again for joining us. Thank you for the audience, for the patience, and for keeping longer than it was envisaged. Keep tuned and stay tuned, and hope to see you, and keep in touch. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon in Austria, and have a nice day here in Canada. Goodbye.